I received a text recently from a reading specialist who tutored at the library, and she said, how do I know if the student I'm working with has visual perception problems? And the real question is, how do I know if the student I'm working with has visual perceptual problems that are interfering with their learning to the point that that needs to be addressed first? And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So here are some signs that your child is gifted in visual perceptual skills. Does he see things in picture form? When he is telling a story, is he imagining it in his mind? Is he looking up and playing the whole video in his mind, every single scene, imagining every single detail, the colors, the movement, everything? Is he gifted visually? Does he have a knack for style? Does he notice hairstyles or clothing styles? Does he want to look a certain way? Is he artistic? Now, some kids can be artistic but still not be able to do art because they might have a weakness in their motor skills. So that one's a little bit hard to tell. They can be gifted artistically and still not be able to actually do art. Can he visualize things from many angles? The child who says, oh, you know, I can imagine what it looks like to see us from the corner of the ceiling. I knew a young man, about 11-year-old boy, who thought everyone looked at, imagined their scene with them in it from up here instead of down here talking to you. Engineers are really good. I knew an engineer who, when I screened him for visual perception problems, said, oh yeah, I can imagine us from here, from there, from everywhere. And that's pretty typical. They also can imagine what a piece of clay could look like if it's sculpted. They can imagine what their artwork is going to look like before it's done. They're the architects, the person who says, oh, if they would only cut their hair that way, they would just look so good. So those are people who can visualize things that don't exist and visualize them from various angles. Does he enjoy putting things together? Does the child enjoy Legos and other building types of toys? Does the child have a tendency towards engineering? Is he or she good at fixing things? So those would be signs that the child is gifted visually and perceptually. But there are other signs that the child's giftedness might actually be interfering with learning. Because remember, we're looking at the visual perceptual skills and we want them in the normal range, right? If they fall too low, there'll be a deficit. If the visual perceptual skills rise above the normal range, then it will be the child will be so visual and spatial that it will interfere with their learning. Here are some signs that the visual spatial skills are interfering with learning. The child makes substitutions or deletions when reading aloud. The child looks at the first letter of the word and guesses at it. She recognizes sight words inconsistently. He skips words or lines when reading. The child is unable to track words sequentially. Now, why would those things be indicators of a visual spatial hyperactivity? Because the child sees no need when they're reading. They see no need to go sequentially, as we talked about on a previous video. They can jump around on the page because they're spatial. They're working on that right hemisphere. That right hemisphere of the brain is very visual and spatial, and creative, remember. So they also think that reading should be creative. They are too strong on that right side. Their right side is above the line, outside of the normal realm. And so they're jumping around on the page because they're spatial and maybe creative as well. Some other signs that the visual-spatial giftedness is interfering with their learning. The child confuses right and left beyond the age of 7 or 8. The child continues to reverse letters and numbers when reading or writing. The child spaces out and daydreams. Now, the reason for that has more to do, in a sense, with their inability, their weakness on this side of the brain, where they are weak sequentially. But because of that, they will, when things come in sequentially, like auditory, because it's also auditory, when things come in auditorily, they can't take it in. It's just too much for them. They can't sort it out. And so they just daydream. And when they do, then they flip over to this side and they imagine things in their mind. So that's just that kind of ADD spaciness is what's going on there, is that they're just living in that daydream world because it's so much easier than it is to be sequential and be focused on the sequential moment, in the moment. Things like the handwriting being extremely poor, messy, light, dark, or laboriously slow. And we talked a little bit about that in a previous video, about how they have such a hard time with spacing their letters. Each letter is a challenge for them visually. So they want to find, they want to write a letter A or whatever. They're like, whoa, where is it? And the spatialness, the lines of the paper might even be moving. And they're like, oh, I gotta find that line. Oh, okay, I got it. All right, now I got another letter. Okay. And they're just having a heck of a time trying to find those letters. In fact, that's one reason why visual spatial kids actually do better with cursive, because they only have to find that line once, and once they find it, they get to stay there. They don't have to keep moving or keep finding the line again. Does he draw his letters instead of writing them? Parents often ask, what does that mean? What that means is they're making an art project out of their writing. And writing is a motor skill, not a visual skill. And so we want the child, or should be, we want the child to be feeling their letters and not visualizing them as a piece of art. Does he put his head very close to the page while he writes? This could be a sign of a primitive reflex, which is a whole nother story, but also because they have visual perception problems, they're right close to that paper there, trying to make sense of those lines. Does the child have a difficult time with the sizing and spacing of letters, where some letters might be, here, and then they might write their next word there, and then they might leave a big gap, and it's like their sizing might be all off, like that. An older child who has difficulty with printing, again, because cursive is easier as far as finding the lines. Has the child completed vision therapy but still struggles? The vision therapy should take care of visual perception problems, but if it doesn't, that could be an indication that the child has an extreme visual perception problem. Another common trait is the child can remember tiny details of the past, especially visual details, and can't remember their schoolwork from yesterday. So that's kind of a funny little thing. People say, my child has amazing memory, but they can't remember their homework. They can't remember their schoolwork. They can't remember their math facts. Well, they can remember that visual detail. Don't you remember? Grandma has that beautiful picture in her bedroom. and you know, it's got these flowers and this and that, and they remember every little detail, but they can't remember the homework. That's because they took a snapshot of it. They stored it spatially in their brain. Those are indicators of signs of visual perceptual giftedness and signs where the visual perceptual giftedness is getting in the way of actual learning. Now, it does happen occasionally that you only get this, you don't get the giftedness, you just get the disability. But that's pretty rare in my experience as far as the kids that I see. Now, here are 3 traits. If your student does any of these, you really know that they have a visual perception weakness. The child reads or writes starting at the right side of the page and going backwards. And if you're doing block exercises and the child's tendency is to always start on the right and go left, then that is a sign of visual perceptual distortions. If the child complains that letters on the page wiggle or move, now most children won't say this because they don't know that that's not normal. They think that that's normal. They don't realize it's moving. Or if they do, they think everybody sees it. So why would they mention it to you? So if the child does express that the letters or lines on the page are moving or wavy, that's a definite sign that their visual perceptual skills are interfering with their learning. And finally, if they complain of nausea or headaches when reading, as long as it's not an anxiety issue, the nausea especially, then it is a visual perceptual weakness. And they're working so hard that it's either, you know, things are moving and stuff that they're getting nauseous, or they're focusing so hard that they're getting a headache. So those 3 signs, starting at the right and going backwards, complaining that letters move on the page, or lines, letters or lines, and nausea or headaches when reading, are signs that the visual perceptual skills are definitely interfering with learning. And I would add to that, which you wouldn't probably see unless you were doing some of these exercises, and you've given them a set like this, okay, that are straight in a row, and they build those blocks at an angle, that is almost assuredly a sign of visual perceptual problems. However, again, that's not something you're going to notice unless you're doing blocks, okay? So that you can't really tell that until you actually get into the exercises, the brain training exercises. So, but that's typically a cue, especially if the child can't correct it. I usually say, okay, you know, try to line your blocks up with the edge of the table. And so having them try to do that. And then if they can't, or they repeatedly build at an angle even after training them, then that's even a stronger indication of a problem there. So one more point about this. I had a student today, and she was like, you know, I felt like everything was really, really hard for her. And I said, you know, honey, I'm sorry if it feels like she's a new student, so she doesn't know me very well. I said, you know, I'm really sorry if you feel like I'm being really mean and really hard on you. I just want to help you. I said, you know, and I tried to explain, and she says, no. She said, finally, someone understands what life is like for me. And so that was really reassuring to me, because you have to get, and she's an older student, she's like 13. So you want to get the student on the same page. But so what I was able to explain to her was that this side of her brain was, well, let's do it right here on our little normal patch, right? Her right side of her brain was way up here, and her left side of her brain, right, left hemisphere was way down there, and that we needed to tone this down and bring it into normal, and exercise this part of the brain and bring it into normal. Because when you have learning problems, it's when the brain is the 2 hemispheres are way out of balance or aren't synchronizing together. So it's okay if you've got, you know, your right brain and your left brain are like this, but not when one is really low and one is really high, outside of the normal range. And so a quick screening tool that you can use are these really cool QBitz, and I'm going to show you a quick little screening you can use in your tutoring session or in your small reading groups to see if any of the kids really need to address this before they actually start really working on their readings. I like to use the QBitz game as an assessment tool to see if the child's visual perceptual skills are interfering with their learning. This particular version is the family version. It has 4 sets in it of different colors, but there's individual sets as well. So the QBitz game has these little cards. So and the student is supposed to replicate the design, and wherever they see black, they will use color. Okay, so to replicate this particular pattern, they would go like this. So this is the most basic one, and I would definitely not use this one for any older students, but a very young child. You could use this this particular pattern, or I like to use this one as well. Again, it's a quite simple design, but it'll give you a feel if the child is having some severe visual perception problems. Okay, if they cannot replicate this, then they're definitely having some problems. So I would again only use these for my youngest students, maybe the 5, 6, 7-year-olds. For most students, I would probably start at about this level.
This is pretty good for the kids in the 8 and 9 range. They should be able to do this one. And then this one I find is good for checking kids who are just a little bit older.
Because the kids will tend to, they'll put the blocks in the corners, the dots in the corner, and they'll get that, but then they get really confused about that diamond, and they will often make a small diamond in the middle, and you can kind of tell by how severe they are by whether they can see they've made a mistake. I mean, if they're looking at that going, I don't know what I did wrong, that doesn't look right. Like I had a student today that went ahead and just put white in all these sections around the edges, and she thought she had it right. So if the student does it incorrectly and thinks that it's right, then that's a real perceptual problem. If they get it incorrect and they're kind of like, something doesn't look right, well then, that their skills aren't quite as bad as the child who just can't even tell that they've made a mistake. But there's lots of different levels in this game that I use first as a screening tool and then later as an actual therapeutic tool, cognitive training tool. So that gives you a little overview of visual perceptual problems. How to identify the visual perceptually gifted child, the child whose visual perceptual skills are overactive and interrupting their ability to learn, a little questionnaire to kind of assess how extreme the child is, and then finally an assessment tool that you can use that will help you determine whether the child actually needs to address their visual perception before working on reading or spelling. So let me know if you have any questions.